In the early morning of April 25, 1644, the Chongzhen Emperor of China climbed a small hill in the garden behind his palace. The forbidden city was quiet. The outer walls of Beijing had fallen the night before to a rebel army, and the emperor had spent the preceding hours killing his daughters with his own hands, ordering his empress and concubines to their deaths, and drinking alone in his chambers. He had dismissed his last attendants. He did not want witnesses. On the hill he found a tree. He tore a strip from the lining of his robe, tied it to a branch, and hanged himself. He was 33 years old. He left a note, written in blood on the inside of his robe, addressed to the rebel commander Lai Zicheng. He asked that the people of the capital be spared. He accepted that his ministers had failed him. He did not ask to be mourned. The note was found when the body was recovered. Whether Lai Zicheng read it is not recorded. What is recorded is that the Chongzhen emperor had reigned for 17 years, that he had changed his grand secretaries more than 50 times, that he had executed or cashiered 17 senior military commanders, that he had worked without respite on a crisis that had been deepening long before he was born. He was not lazy. He was not corrupt. He was not incompetent. He was a man who had inherited an institutional catastrophe and could not escape it, and he knew, in that final hour, that he had failed, and he died alone, which was the only appropriately stark conclusion to what his dynasty had become. The Ming Dynasty had governed China for 276 years. At its height, it ran the world's largest economy. It built the Forbidden City and the Great Wall in their current form. It sent fleets of enormous treasure ships across the Indian Ocean. It administered over 100 million people through a bureaucratic apparatus of breathtaking sophistication. It produced some of the finest porcelain, silk, and lacquerwork in human history. It was, by almost any measure, the most powerful state on earth for most of the 15th century, and a state of extraordinary wealth and complexity throughout the 16th. And yet in 1644 it was gone. Not slowly faded, not absorbed into a successor dynasty after a long-managed transition, but genuinely destroyed, the capital taken by rebels, the emperor dead by his own hand, the governing apparatus dissolved. The questions are how and why. The answers are not simple because the Ming did not fall to one thing. It fell to 4 things at once, and it fell because its institutional structure, the structure the founding emperor had deliberately built to be resistant to change, could not adapt to any of them. To understand the collapse, you have to start with the founder. Zhu Yuanzhang, who became the Hongwu emperor in 1368, was not a product of the governing class. He was the orphaned son of a tenant farmer. He had begged for food as a child. He had been a Buddhist novice at a monastery. He had become a soldier, and then a rebel commander in the chaos of the Yuan dynasty's collapse, rising through a combination of military ability, strategic ruthlessness, and a talent for selecting capable subordinates that the more aristocratic rebel leaders around him conspicuously lacked. He founded a dynasty from literally nothing, from hunger and a beggar's bowl, and this origin shaped everything he built. Hongwu was suspicious of the governing class because he had been governed by it. He was suspicious of merchant wealth because he had seen it accumulate while peasants starved. He was suspicious of powerful officials because he understood from personal experience that powerful officials were the primary mechanism through which dynasties collapsed. His response to these suspicions was systematic and drastic. He abolished the office of prime minister entirely in 1380 after executing the incumbent on charges of conspiracy. No office that concentrated executive power in a single non-imperial official would ever be recreated. All matters of governance would come directly to the emperor. The emperor alone would be the state's executive center. He then purged the bureaucratic class in 2 massive waves, the Hu Weiyang case in 1380 and the Lan Yu case in 1393, that killed tens of thousands of officials and their family members. The terror was not simply about the accused conspirators. It was about the administrative culture. Officials who survived the purges understood, at a cellular level, that initiative was dangerous, that remonstrance was dangerous, that any action that could be characterized as exceeding one's mandate was dangerous. The Ming bureaucracy that emerged from Hongwu's reign was efficient in routine tasks and paralyzed in emergencies. It was a system optimized for an extremely strong and attentive emperor, which Hongwu himself was, and catastrophically vulnerable to weak ones. The second foundational decision was Yonggle's. When Zhu Dai, the fourth emperor, seized the throne from his nephew in the Civil War of 1402, he moved the capital from Nanjing to Beijing. The reasons were partly strategic. He wanted to be closer to the Mongolian frontier he had spent his career defending, and partly personal. Beijing was his power base. He had governed it for decades, but the move had consequences no one fully calculated at the time. Beijing sits in the north. The Yangtze River Delta, the agricultural and commercial heartland of China, the region that grew the most rice and wove the most silk and generated the most taxable surplus, sits hundreds of miles to the south. The capital that Yongle built at Beijing would have to be fed by grain shipped northward along the Grand Canal, an operation requiring enormous annual logistical effort. The gap between where the wealth was produced and where the government was centered would become, over centuries, one of the structural fissures through which the dynasty's fiscal integrity slowly cracked. For the first century and a half, the Ming was magnificent. The Qing Emperor, who reigned in the 1420s and 1430, governed with a skill and lightness of touch that made his era a later standard of good rule. The Chenghua and Hongzhi emperors managed their courts competently. The Jiajing Emperor, who came to the throne in 1521 and reigned for 45 years, was the first clear sign that the Hongwu model had reached its limits. Jiajing was not stupid, but he was obsessed with Taoist ritual, with the search for longevity elixirs, with the ceremonial questions of how he should honor his own father, a man who had never been emperor, in the imperial ancestral rites. He refused to leave the inner court for decades. He governed through intermediaries, primarily through the grand secretaries who processed paperwork and the eunuchs who physically carried documents between the inner palace and the outer court. The problem was not that Jiajing was incompetent. The problem was that the system Hongwu had built required a hands-on emperor to function as designed. And the moment a capable emperor was replaced by an inward-facing one, the executive vacuum at the center became a battleground for the factions who rushed to fill it. The Confucian scholar officials who staffed the outer bureaucracy competed for influence through the Grand Secretariat. The palace eunuchs competed for influence through their physical proximity to the emperor. Factional conflict, not over policy but over access, appointments and precedents, consumed the energy of the governing class in proportion to the emperor's disengagement from governance. The one figure of the late Ming who nearly broke this dynamic was Zheng. He served as Grand Secretary from 1572 to 1582, during the first decade of the Wanli Emperor's reign, when the emperor was a child, and Zheng governed with an authority no official since Hongwu's abolition of the prime ministership had exercised. Zheng implemented the single whip reform, consolidating the empire's complex and inconsistent array of labor obligations, grain taxes, and local levies into a single annual silver payment. It was an administrative achievement of enormous importance. It made the tax system legible. It reduced the opportunities for local corruption. It aligned the tax collection system with the reality of a monetized economy. Zheng also conducted the first genuine national land survey since the early Ming, a survey that revealed how much taxable land had been concealed from the registers by powerful families over the preceding century. The survey filled the treasury. For 1 decade, the Ming state actually worked as it was supposed to work. Taxes were collected, grain reserves were maintained, frontier defense was adequately funded. Zheng was not universally admired. He governed with a domineering confidence that made enemies, and he tolerated corruption in his allies. But he was the last statesman who saw what needed to be done and had the political authority to do it. When Zheng died in 1582, the Wanli Emperor, now an adult, and deeply resentful of the man who had governed his childhood with such unrelenting authority, moved immediately. Zheng's family was investigated, his assets stripped, his reforms quietly reversed. The land survey results were not maintained, the tax simplifications drifted back toward complexity, and the emperor himself, having freed himself from Zhang's supervision, discovered that governing was harder and less satisfying than resisting governance. He retreated. He stopped attending court audiences. He delayed appointments for years. He refused to name a crown prince for 15 years, paralyzing the government with the succession question. He was not insane, not incompetent, but deeply uninterested in the work of ruling, and the system his ancestor had built gave him almost no mechanism for forcing a disengaged emperor back into engagement. While the Wanli emperor retreated into the palace, a new threat was forming in the forests north and east of the Great Wall. Nurhasai was the chieftain of a minor Jurchen clan who had watched the Ming murder his father and grandfather in 1583. What he felt about that murder, whether it was primarily grief or primarily calculation, is not knowable at this distance. What is clear is that over the next 30 years he built, with remarkable patience and consistency, something the Jurchen had never had before, a unified political and military structure capable of projecting sustained power against the Ming. The key innovation was the 8 banners system, formalized around 1601. Every Jurchen household was assigned to one of 8 military banners, organized by colored flags. The banner was simultaneously a military unit, a census record, a tax collection apparatus, and a welfare system. It bound the warrior and his family into a permanent institution with a continuous identity. Where previous steppe confederations had been loose coalitions that fell apart when a strong leader died, the 8 banners created institutional continuity that did not depend on any individual's personality or longevity. The Ming watched Nurhasai's consolidation with the comfortable dismissal of a great power, observing what it classified as a manageable tributary people. It was watching the construction of the instrument of its own destruction. The Ming's inability to see the Jurchen as an existential threat was partly the arrogance of an enormous state looking at a frontier confederation, and partly the distraction of its own internal disorder. The decade of the 1610s was the decade when 2 of the Ming's great structural problems began to compound each other in earnest. The first was the silver system. Since the late 16th century, when the ban on maritime trade had been lifted and the Manila galleons had begun carrying American silver into Chinese ports, the Ming economy had become increasingly monetized. Taxes were paid in silver. Government salaries were paid in silver. Merchant transactions ran on silver. This created an economy of extraordinary vitality in the coastal provinces, but fragility at the center. The Ming state's tax apparatus, designed by Hongwu for a grain-based agrarian economy, captured only a fraction of the enormous commercial wealth flowing through the Yangtze Delta. Merchant families accumulated vast silver holdings. The state remained dependent on land taxes paid by peasants who, in the north, were increasingly poor. The second problem was the court's factional warfare, which by the 1610s had crystallized around the conflict between the Donglin Academy and the eunuch faction. The Donglin scholars, a loose network of reformist Confucian officials centered on the Donglin Academy in Wuxi, advocated tax reform, the reduction of eunuch influence, and a politics of moral seriousness. Their opponents, officials who had made their careers through eunuch patronage and who saw the Donglin movement as an existential threat to their positions, responded with slander, false accusation, and eventually, under the Tianqi emperor, systematic political terror. The Tianqi emperor was not interested in governing. He was interested in carpentry. He was a skilled woodworker who spent his days in the palace workshop, making furniture and architectural models, while his wet nurse, Madame Qi, and her ally, the eunuch Wei Zhongxian, effectively ran the empire. Wei Zhongxian is one of the most remarkable figures in Chinese history, and not in a way that reflects well on the institution that produced him. He was illiterate. He had entered the palace as a young man after losing all his money gambling, and having himself castrated to qualify for palace service. He was clever in the specific way that people who cannot read or write, but must survive in a world of literate politicians, become clever. Acutely attuned to personal dynamics, ruthlessly effective at building loyalty networks, and completely unconstrained by any moral framework that the Confucian educational tradition might have installed. Under wise de facto leadership, the Eastern Depot, the Palace Intelligence Service, was turned against the Donglin faction with systematic brutality. Scholars were accused of forming treasonous cliques, arrested, tortured, and executed. The 6 Donglin martyrs, Yang Lion, Zhuo Guangdu, and 4 others, were killed in prison under conditions of deliberate cruelty in 1625. The men who had argued most loudly for tax reform, for reduction of palace extravagance, for honest governance, were gone. The men who remained in office had demonstrated through their survival that they would not make those arguments. The timing was catastrophic. The decade between roughly 1620 and 1630 was precisely when the Little Ice Age's most extreme phase descended on northern China. The science is not ambiguous. Tree-ring records, ice cores, contemporaneous harvest chronicles, and surviving tax records all tell the same story. The temperatures dropped, the frost season lengthened, the precipitation patterns shifted. In northern China, in Shaanxi, Henan, the provinces that formed the agrarian core of the dynasty's most densely settled territory, the harvests began to fail. The failure was not uniform, and it was not every year. It was worse than that. It was intermittent in a way that prevented adaptation. A village might get one decent harvest, plan again with hope, and lose everything the following year. A district that had survived on thin margins might suffer 3 consecutive crop failures and exhaust its reserves before the 4th year brought a partial recovery that came too late, to people already dead or fled. The famine did not move through China like a wave. It moved like a weather system, unpredictable, localized in its worst impacts, impossible to plan for at the scale of the imperial government. The Ming's famine relief system had worked, more or less, during the dynasty's functioning centuries. The granary system, the ever-normal granaries maintained at the county level to provide emergency grain in shortage years, was supposed to buffer exactly these crises. But the granaries required funding to stock. The funding required functioning tax collection. The tax collection had been deteriorating for decades as the bureaucracy thinned, the great families sheltered their wealth, and the agricultural base of the north slowly impoverished. When the famine struck in earnest, many of the granaries were empty. Where the granaries had grain, the distribution system was controlled by local officials who had strong incentives to prioritize the powerful over the desperate. The famine relief the state could deliver was a fraction of what the scale of the crisis required. In this environment, the imperial postal relay system became an unexpected flashpoint. The postal network, the infrastructure that carried government communications, military dispatches, and official travel across the empire, was maintained by assessments on local governments. When the local governments could not pay their assessments, the postal stations could not pay their workers. In 1629, with the fiscal crisis deepening, the central government ordered a systematic reduction of the postal network as a cost-cutting measure. Hundreds of stations were closed. Thousands of postal workers and relay soldiers were dismissed without compensation, without a pension, without any provision for men who had dedicated their working lives to the imperial service and found themselves suddenly with nothing, in a countryside already stripped of reserves by years of poor harvests. Among the men dismissed in 1629 was a postal relay station worker named Zicheng from Mijai County in Shanxi Province. He was somewhere in his mid-20s. He had no particular education, no particular social standing, no resources. What he did have, and what would become the central political fact of the dynasty's final years, was nothing left to lose. Zicheng joined the rebel bands already forming across Shaanxi under commanders who had appeared in the vacuum left by famine and institutional failure. These were not, initially, ideological movements. They were survival organizations, Men without food banded together for mutual protection. Men with some military experience from border service took command. The bands raided granaries, attacked tax collectors, and moved on before the authorities could mobilize. They were crushed repeatedly, scattered and seemingly destroyed, and then reformed and expanded because the conditions that had produced them had not changed. Every time the Ming's counterinsurgency forces suppressed a rebel band, they did so by moving through territory that was simultaneously producing new recruits, men displaced by famine, soldiers who had not been paid in months, local officials who had lost faith in the dynasty they served. Zicheng was crushed several times in the 1630. He went to ground in mountain passes and remote valleys. He reorganized. He developed a tactical understanding of how to use terrain to preserve a force that the state wanted to destroy. He developed political instincts that went beyond simple banditry. He understood that the people he moved through were not simply resources to be extracted but potential supporters, and that a rebel commander who looted indiscriminately was harvesting short-term survival at the cost of long-term power. His moment came in 1641. He captured Luoyang, one of the great northern cities, and found there the residence of the Prince of Fu, a son of the Wanli Emperor, one of the most spectacularly wealthy members of the imperial family, living in a palace compound behind walls that enclosed more grain, more silver, and more luxury goods than most of the surrounding province possessed combined. Zicheng killed the prince and opened the granaries to the city's population. This act was not simply military. It was a political statement of stunning clarity. Here was the wealth of the empire. Here were the people starving. Here was the connection between those two facts, a connection the Confucian scholar officials had described in their memorials to the throne for decades, but which had never before been made visceral, physical, real in the way it was real when the doors of an imperial granary swung open and the grain poured out into hands that had not eaten for days. The people of Luoyang and its surrounding counties understood what had just happened. They joined Zicheng in vast numbers. The Chongzhen emperor, who had come to the throne in 1627 at the age of 16, and had moved immediately against the Wei Zhongxian faction with an energy that suggested he understood the dynasty's problems, was watching all of this with a clarity that made his helplessness more tragic. He saw the fiscal crisis. He raised taxes, the Liaobian tax, the Jiaoxi tax, the training tax, military surtaxes intended to fund the armies required to fight on two fronts simultaneously, against the rebels in the interior and the Manchu confederation on the northeastern frontier. The surtaxes were extracted from a peasant population already at the edge of survival. They accelerated the collapse they were designed to prevent, pushing marginal households from distress to destitution, adding recruits to rebel armies with every district the tax collectors passed through. The northeastern frontier was its own catastrophe. The Battle of Sarhu in 1619 had destroyed 4 Ming armies simultaneously. From that point forward, the Ming could not field a credible offensive force on the Manchurian frontier. The Manchu, who had renamed themselves under Han Taiji's leadership, dropping the Jurchen name to signal that their state was something new, something larger, raided into China proper with near impunity. They bypassed the Great Wall through alliances with Mongol tribes who controlled the steppe approaches, swinging west and then south to strike deep into Hebei, Shandong, even approaching Beijing itself. In 1629, Manchu forces came within 40 miles of the capital. The Chongzhen emperor's response to this incursion was to execute Yuan Chonghuan. Yuan Chonghuan was the general who had, 3 years earlier, successfully defended the fortress of Ningyuan using Portuguese artillery, the only significant Ming military success on the frontier in a decade. He was the commander whose talents, energy, and strategic vision offered the dynasty its best remaining chance of stabilizing the northeastern frontier. The execution, carried out on false charges of conspiring with the Manchu, was the product of a court environment so poisoned by factional accusation, so trained by decades of Wei Zhongxian's terror to see treason and incompetence, that the emperor received the charges against his best general and believed them. Yuan Chonghuan was executed by slow slicing, one of the most agonizing deaths in the imperial penal code, and the crowds at the execution reportedly ate pieces of his flesh as an expression of popular anger. He was not betraying China. He was the last general who might have saved it. By the late 1630, the Chongzhen emperor was conducting governance through crisis triage. Military commanders requested money. Money was not available. Provincial governors reported famine. Famine relief was not available. The northeastern frontier required reinforcement. Reinforcement diverted from the interior campaigns against the rebels. The interior campaigns required suppression. Suppression was impossible without northern frontier stability. Every resource allocation solved one problem and created another. The emperor worked. He read memorials late into the night. He dismissed officials who failed and appointed new ones who then failed in the same ways because the structural conditions that produced failure had not changed. He was intelligent enough to see the trap. He was not powerful enough to escape it. The plague arrived to compound the catastrophe. Bubonic plague, carried by the rats and fleas displaced by the ecological disruption of years of drought, famine, and human dislocation, struck the North China Plain in the early 1640 with a ferocity that contemporary accounts describe in terms that strained their writers' capacity for understatement. Kaifeng, one of the greatest cities of northern China, lost an estimated third of its population in a single epidemic wave. Military garrisons were struck as hard as civilian populations. The Ming's defensive capacity on the northern frontier and in the interior simultaneously withered under an epidemic that moved faster than any military response could. The final act began in 1643. Lai Zicheng captured Xi'an, the ancient capital of Shaanxi, and declared the Qing Dynasty. He was no longer a bandit, no longer a regional warlord. He was, in his own proclamation, and in the understanding of millions who had joined his cause, the legitimate successor to the Ming Mandate, the dynasty that had failed its people having forfeited its right to rule, and a new order arising from the will of the people expressed through the arithmetic of hunger. In early 1644, Lai Zicheng marched north. The route from Xi'an to Beijing passes through provinces the Ming had governed for 2.5 centuries. Those provinces did not hold. County seats surrendered without resistance. Prefectural cities capitulated at the approach of the vanguard. The garrison commanders who had not received pay in months, who commanded soldiers who had not received pay in months, made calculations that were not difficult. Beijing was not the last fortress of a dynasty in arms. It was the bureaucratic headquarters of an administration that had already lost the physical territory it was supposed to administer. The capital garrison was 60,000 men on paper. In practice, many were dead from plague, absent from desertion, or incapable of meaningful resistance. On April 24, 1644, Lai Zicheng's forces breached the outer walls. The inner walls fell during the night. The Chongzhen emperor spent his final hours in the actions already described, killing those he could not leave to the mercy of the rebels, leaving instructions about the handling of his people, climbing the hill alone in the darkness before dawn. Lai Zicheng entered Beijing the next day. His forces looted the city. His commanders demanded silver from the surviving officials, silver that the rebel administration had correctly calculated. The Ming officials had hidden away during decades of service in an administration whose salaries were erratic and whose pension was non-existent. The torture of captured Ming officials to extract their hidden wealth was systematic, and to those who had lived under Wei Zhongxian's terror, an uncomfortable echo. Lai Zicheng held Beijing for 41 days. They were 41 days in which he needed to consolidate power, win over the governing class, stabilize the economy, and present himself as a credible successor to the Ming. He failed to do any of these things. His administration was an army's camp headquarters projected onto a capital city. His followers expected rewards. The rewards came from looting. The looting destroyed the economic activity that would have provided sustainable revenue. The Confucian scholars who had survived the Ming and might have staffed a new administration looked at the Shun court and saw barbarity, not legitimacy. On the northeastern frontier, the general Wu Sangui commanded the last substantial intact Ming army. His position was the fortress at Shanhai Pass, where the Great Wall meets the sea, the hinge point that would determine who controlled the approach to Beijing. Wu Sangui had been in negotiation with both sides. He had offered to submit to Lai Zicheng's Shun Dynasty. Then the news reached him that Lai Zicheng's forces had captured and abused his father, and possibly his concubine Chen Yuan. The historical sources are not entirely clear on the sequence of events or the relative weight of personal and political motivations in what Wu Sangui decided next. What is clear is that he decided. He opened Shanhai Pass to the Manchu. The King Regent Dorgan, governing on behalf of the young Shunjai Emperor, had been waiting with the Manchu-Mongol Han-Chinese coalition army on the other side of the wall. He marched through. At the battle outside Beijing, Lai Zicheng's forces, tired from the siege, administratively overwhelmed, and facing an army of a different quality and organization than any they had encountered in the interior of China, were decisively defeated. Lai Zicheng retreated from Beijing. He never regained political coherence. He died the following year. The sources disagree on whether he was killed by local militia or took his own life. The king entered Beijing in June 1644. Dorgan performed the mourning rites for the Chongzhen emperor. He issued an edict. The king had come not to conquer China but to avenge it. The dynasty that had lost the mandate of heaven through its inability to govern had been swept away by the rebels. The king, whose founder Narhasai had been a subject of the Ming and who had admired its institutions even as he prepared to replace it, was restoring order. The examination system would continue. The Confucian rites would be maintained. Officials who submitted would keep their posts. The people who had suffered under the late Ming's fiscal catastrophe and the rebels' looting would have their suffering acknowledged. This framing was calculated. Dorgan and Hong Taiji before him had spent years preparing the ideological case for king legitimacy in Chinese terms, but it was not entirely cynical. The king genuinely maintained the major institutions of Ming governance. The examination system continued until 1905. The Confucian bureaucratic structure was preserved. The king emperors, particularly Kangxi and Qianlong, became serious students of Chinese classical culture. The transition from Ming to Qing was, from the perspective of Chinese political theory, less a conquest than a succession, a new dynasty arising when the old had lost the mandate through its failure to govern. It did not feel that way in the South. For 18 years after the fall of Beijing, Ming claimants and Ming loyalists maintained resistance across southern China in a series of rump courts, the Southern Ming, that the history of the period tends to treat as footnotes because they ultimately failed, but which were, for the people who fought and died in them, the substance of an entire era. The Prince of Fu held Nanjing for a year. The Prince of Tang held Fujian for 2. The Prince of Gui, the Yongle Emperor, led a resistance that wandered through Guangdong, Guangxi, Yunnan, and eventually into Burma, lasting until 1662. The naval commander Koxinga, born to a Chinese merchant father and a Japanese mother, drove the Dutch from Taiwan in 1661 and established a Ming loyalist state on the island that the king did not extinguish until 1683. The Southern Ming were not simply military failures. They were the last expression of a governing idea, that the mandate of heaven had not passed from the Ming, that the dynasty that had built so much of what China was could not simply be ended by a military defeat and a Manchu regent's edict. The scholars and officials and soldiers who maintained the resistance knew they were losing. Many of them knew it from early on. They continued because the alternative, accepting the king's legitimacy, required accepting that the civilization they had served, the examination tradition, the Confucian moral framework, the ancestral rites, were now the property of outsiders who wore their hair differently and whose women did not bind their feet. The king would prove in time to be a competent and in many respects brilliant governing dynasty. The Kangxi Emperor, who came to the throne in 1661 and the Qianlong Emperor, who reigned until 1796, oversaw a century of unprecedented expansion, prosperity, and cultural achievement. They maintained the examination system, patronized Chinese classical learning, incorporated the Ming's institutional innovations, and governed a larger territory more effectively than the late Ming had governed its reduced domain. By the late 17th century, the Qing state had solved the fiscal problems that had destroyed its predecessor. It conducted land surveys, maintained functional granaries, paid its armies reliably, and governed with a consistent attention to the relationship between taxation and agricultural capacity that the late Ming had entirely lost. None of this explains away the collapse. It illuminates it. The contrast between what the Qing built and what the Ming had allowed to deteriorate shows exactly where the Ming's institutional structure had failed. The late Ming state knew its granaries were understocked. It knew its land registers were falsified. It knew its tax base was shrinking. It knew its frontier armies were underpaid. It had officials, the Donglan scholars, men like Zheng, men like Yuan Chonghuan, who wrote clearly and urgently about all of these problems and proposed specific solutions to them. The solutions were never implemented because the institutional structure could not implement them. The emperor who designed the dynasty had built it to resist reform. Hongwu's greatest success, the creation of a durable, sophisticated, literate bureaucratic state that could survive bad emperors and maintain itself across centuries, was simultaneously the system's fatal weakness. It survived bad emperors by grinding through routine administrative functions. It could not adapt to crises that required new policies, new revenue systems, new approaches to frontier defense. Every reform required either imperial authority or factional consensus. Imperial authority was intermittently absent. Factional consensus was structurally impossible in a court environment where factions competed for survival rather than policy. The Little Ice Age did not cause the Ming collapse. The Manchu did not cause it. Zicheng did not cause it. Each of them, the climate catastrophe, the military threat from the northeast, the social revolution from within, arrived at a dynasty that had been consuming its own capacity for adaptation for 2 generations. Each of them, in isolation, might have been managed. The Ming faced all 3 simultaneously, in the decade of the 1620s and 1630, after the Wei Zhongxian decade had destroyed the administrative class capable of managing any of them, after the Wanli emperor's paralysis had depleted the treasury, after the Donglan scholars had been killed or silenced. The Chongzhen emperor is the figure who most clearly shows the tragedy of what the Ming became. He was, by contemporary accounts and by the evidence of his 17 years of relentless work, a genuinely serious man who understood the problems he faced. His final note, the blood-written plea to spare his people, the acceptance of personal failure, is not the note of a man who did not care. It is the note of a man who cared profoundly and could not, in the end, turn caring into the institutional capacity his dynasty had lost. On Coal Hill in the Palace Garden, in the dark before dawn on April 25, 1644, the world's largest economy ended. Not because it ran out of wealth, China's wealth had not disappeared. Not because it ran out of people, the population was devastated but present. Not because it ran out of the institutional knowledge that had built the examination system, the Forbidden City, the Grand Canal, the centuries of documentation and governance. It ended because the institutions built to manage that wealth, those people, and that knowledge had calcified into a form that could not respond to the world as it actually was. The mandate of heaven, the ancient Chinese concept that legitimate rule requires genuinely serving the people, had been forfeited not by any single act of tyranny, but by the accumulated weight of a governing structure that no longer could. The tree on Coal Hill was still standing when the king arrived. They left it standing. For years, it was visited by those who wished to mark what had ended there. Later it was fenced off and labeled, preserved as the site where the last Ming emperor died. The site still exists. The tree, or rather, a successor tree planted where the original was believed to stand, is still there, in the garden of what is now Jingshan Park in Beijing, behind the Forbidden City that the Ming built and the king inherited. The dynasty that had run the world's largest economy for nearly 3 centuries was gone. What replaced it was different in culture, in language, in origin, but it was built on the same ground, using many of the same tools, serving many of the same people. The continuity of Chinese civilization across the Ming-Qing transition is a testament to the depth of what the Ming had built. The collapse itself, the 17 years of Chongzhen's desperate governance, the famine cascades of the 1630s, the plague years, the rebel armies marching on Beijing, the emperor climbing his hill alone, is a testament to what happens when institutions designed for stability become incapable of change. The Ming was magnificent. It was also, in the end, a trap that its own founders had built and that its last emperor could not escape.